You probably know that the Oxford English Dictionary selects a word of the year annually, right about this time. A word that seems to catch the spirit of the year that's just come to a close. The lexicographers, the dictionary people, look at new words that may have recently entered into common usage, as well as at old words that might have taken on a new resonance in this particular context. And this year's word is one of the second kind. Did anybody already see what this is? The word for this year is toxic. What a word to describe a year, huh? But when I read the announcement this past week, it did make sense. When I was young, toxic was an ordinary descriptive word used for poisonous things. The industrial waste that leaked into a river, or the drain cleaning chemicals kept high up in a cabinet. In my home growing up, we had these little green stickers with a cartoon character called Mr. Yuck on them. I don't know if anybody else remembers those. It was this grimacing face with a tongue sticking out to alert children that they should stay away from the bottle this sticker is on because it's poisonous. It's toxic. But in recent years, and particularly over the last year, toxic has taken on a metaphorical life of its own. It's a word that people are reaching for in all sorts of contexts to describe not just things that would poison your body, but situations and environments that could poison your spirit. In their broad research into how the word was used over the last year, the Oxford folks found that chemical was still the word most commonly paired with toxic, so toxic chemical, but number 2 was masculinity. Also in the top 10 list of words paired with toxic were environment, relationship, and culture, all referring to climates or patterns of behavior that can make one deeply and profoundly sick. So there's the word of the year for 2018. And the word for 2 years ago is another one that speaks volumes about this particular moment that we're in. The word from 2016 was post-truth, which is defined as relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. It's a word for a world in which facts are no longer seeming all that important, and it was and is overwhelmingly used in reference to politics. I leave you to supply the examples. So those two words don't paint a very pretty picture of the world that we're living in, do they? It sounds like a world high on destructive behaviors, high on reactivity, and very low on trust and shared understandings, to say nothing of a sense of belonging. It's not a pretty picture. And here we are on Christ the King Sunday, this day that's been set aside for about the past 90 years for readings and songs and prayers pointing to Jesus' royal authority. So what in the world can it mean for us to call Jesus King in this toxic post-truth moment, especially when the way that he speaks about his kingship has everything to do with truth? That's the question that I hear our reading from John's Gospel putting in front of us today. The scene takes place on the morning of the last day of Jesus' life. You probably know that. A few days ago, he entered Jerusalem with his followers in this big fanfare spectacle that nobody could miss, with psalms and cries all pointing to him as the coming Messiah, the new king for the Jewish people. Neither the religious nor the political powers in town particularly liked this kind of demonstration, so together they conspired to put a stop to him. And then 12 hours or so before our reading, a detachment of Roman soldiers came to arrest him, and he spent a sleepless night being dragged from the garden where he'd gone to pray to the high priest's house, and now to the Roman headquarters in town. And now Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor appointed to watch over things in this province of Judea, wants to speak with Jesus privately for a few minutes. What we have is their whole conversation. And Pilate cuts right to the chase. "Are you the king of the Jews?" he asks. A way to translate that might be, are you here for a political revolt? Are you trying to change the powers around here? Because if so, we're going to have a problem. Jesus responds with those cryptic words about his kingdom being of a different sort and coming from a different place. And then he tells Pilate this, "For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth." So what does that mean? The idea of living in a post-truth world, I think, is that my reactions, my emotions, are more important than anything else. It doesn't matter what's really true when it comes to what caused the wildfires in California, or what has led millions of people to flee their home countries in recent years. All that matters is what feels true to me. You've got your way to explain things, and I've got mine. And don't get me wrong, I'm a big believer in listening to one's feelings. I can't imagine a lot of good coming from ignoring our personal experiences or the signals that we're getting in our bodies and spirits through our emotions. But that's not the whole story of life, right? There are also facts to listen to. There are experiences of others very different from me. In the deep and, I think, toxic cynicism of the moment we're living in, those other things can be all but ignored. Pilate is not living in 2018, but I think you can hear a similar spirit in the way that he responds when Jesus says he came to testify to the truth. Look, whoever you are, I just met you today, but you can't go around pretending to be king, riling people up, causing a disturbance. Here's what I know. Rome is in power here. My job is to keep things quiet, and you are standing in the way and speaking about truth of all things. So come on, tell me, what is truth anyway? And it's Jesus' response that totally captivates me right now. This one who says he came as a witness to the truth doesn't argue, doesn't lecture, doesn't even speak in response to that question. He simply stands there, meeting Pilate's question with silence, meeting the question with his human presence. In 2013, when large-scale protests had been shaking Istanbul and other cities in Turkey for a few weeks, a man made international headlines for doing something completely ordinary. Some of you might have seen this at the time. These protests that had been taking place were focused on a wide variety of concerns, chief among them the oppressive and violent practices of the government. And the protests had been passionate and loud and aggressive. In predictable fashion, the government had responded with a heavy hand, violently breaking up demonstrations and even chasing down individual protesters. It was a horrible scene that appeared doomed to keep repeating itself. Neither side was backing down. And then on June 17th, at 6 p.m., Erdoğan Gündüz planted his feet in Tahrir Square in Istanbul and simply stood still, with his hands in his pockets, and stared straight ahead in silence at the Turkish flags that were flying from a nearby building. He stood like that for 8 hours in silence. And when he left at 2 a.m., hundreds of people had joined him, doing exactly the same thing, standing motionless in complete silence, staring at these flags. The image was so simple, it doesn't sound like very much on paper. But when you look at a video or a photograph of the scene, it's totally arresting. Of course, it had some political genius to it. One article called Gündüz's protest both an affront and a question for the authorities. Beat him? Why? He's just standing there. Leave him alone? Well, he wins then, doesn't he? There's no question that this was a cunning move. But far beyond the political calculations, the gesture was profoundly human. To see one person, and then 10, and then 70, and then hundreds, and then thousands in similar protests in cities all over the country. To see these people standing there, without words, without shouts, with nothing but themselves and their hands in their pockets. It said more than any slogan or argument. It said simply, "Here we are. What are you going to do?" When Pilate asked that question that has captivated readers for centuries, what is truth? You would expect Jesus would have an answer, right? You would think he would tell him, explain the doctrine of the incarnation, maybe give him a copy of the Nicene Creed. You would expect this one who came as a witness to the truth to speak a whole bunch of true words, right? But instead, Jesus just stands there, silently witnessing to the profoundest truth that there is: his presence. The presence of an individual human life, looking Pilate and us square in the eye. Jesus doesn't come as a lecturer full of words meant to answer every question and win every argument. He comes as a human being, as a body, as the truth of another's presence standing before us and saying simply, "Here I am. Here I am, with empty hands and no force to back me up. Here I am, with eyes that see you. Here I am. What are you going to do?" Pilate leaves the room. That's what he does in the very next verse. I imagine he can't tolerate that look that can topple worlds for very long. So what will we do? What will we do with Jesus looking at us through the eyes of another human being? Through the eyes of a friend or a stranger or someone as unlikely as this poor, powerless, handcuffed, no-name peasant from a no-name village? Will we allow our eyes to meet theirs? Will we allow their lives to make a demand on ours? Will we allow our worlds to be disturbed and our hearts to be cracked open? Those questions seem so important to me in this toxic post-truth time. And if we mean to call Jesus King, the highest authority in our lives, they are just the sort of questions that we're faced with. Because Jesus the King is there, meeting us in the truth of other lives, reminding us that the presence of another is sacred, reminding us that in spite of all the barriers human beings put up, we still belong to each other. Here I am, Jesus says. What are you going to do? Amen.